Hello, welcome to Conversation Starters with Jewish Museum Milwaukee. Each week we look at some sort of issue or topic or program that's going on in the community, and we use this as a time to go into a little bit of a deeper dive into that issue. And today I'm delighted to have Dr. Stephen Moffic with us to look at racism, which is a huge topic that we're going to try and compress into a 30-minute discussion, really examining what's going on today. Dr. Moffic has been exploring racism, anti-Semitism, anti-Islam, Islamic sentiment in the United States for the last 50 years. So I feel like you're uniquely situated to start this exploration with us. So if you would care to, can you give us a sense of how you started your study of racism?
Yes, Ellie, and thank you for the nice comments. We'll see how well I do, because it's a really controversial topic. And let me apologize in advance to anybody out there if I say something that seems a little offensive. Sometimes that's almost inevitable in talking about racism. So back when I started, quickly go back to medical school 50 years ago, and I wanted to become a doctor, partially because that's what my Jewish mother wanted, of course, and not uncommon. But I didn't really like biology, so psychology or psychiatry was on my mind, and I decided on psychiatry. And this was in the late 60s, so a lot was going on as far as civil rights and racism was concerned, you know. And so I didn't really know about Tikkun Olam, but what I decided to do in psychiatry was to try to take care of the underserved and misserved patients, which turned out to fit Tikkun Olam. And that's where I emphasized my whole career. So early on, it became obvious that African Americans, especially poor African Americans, got misdiagnosed, they didn't get proper treatment, and so on. And so I devoted a lot of my career to that, as well as other underserved groups. And then you sort of come up to the current time now, and in a way, some of the same problems are occurring in society and psychiatry that happened in the mid-late 1960s. But I would say we have made progress since then, but there's a lot more to do, and I think we have more tools to do them now. So I'm sort of optimistic.
Optimism is a wonderful thing to have in this kind of point in which you're like, what can I hold on to? When you talk about because it sounds like there are a number of issues at play. One of those issues is an issue of equity and access. How would you define that kind of as a broad institutional challenge in terms of both access to healthcare as you saw it, but then kind of equity in broader society? So it's a bigger question and two parts.
Yeah, you know, that's one of, there's at least three important levels of racism. One of is systemic racism, meaning racism that you see all over society. Another is institutional, which has to do with a particular institution, and then our own personal racism. So, you know, the structural racism has affected everything in society, including medical care, although you would think medical care would be, it wouldn't show up in medical care, but it does. You know, Black Americans have tended to develop some appropriate mistrust of medicine, in part because some of the research we did without telling them, people who had syphilis and they were untreated, and then they didn't obviously do well, but they weren't told about it. There's been several of those. So a lot of mistrust, which prevents people from coming in unless there's Black physicians or Black psychiatrists there. But those numbers have been small, but they are rising. And I think we're trying to show ways that we are concerned about Black American patients, both in medicine and psychiatry. And now we have a cohort of Black physicians to kind of join with. So things are going better, but we've had a lot to overcome. In other parts of society, like the police and education and so on, we're seeing some of the same issues. You know, how do we make those systems better and anti-racist, so to speak?
In your research, what does drive racism in society? What are the things that you kind of pick up on that are part of that systemic approach?
Well, maybe it's worth giving a little speculation on what causes racism in the first place, perhaps, as well as anti-Semitism, as well as any of the discrimination. We don't know this for sure, but it seems like it's part of human nature, part of the way we are. And that's why it's so hard to get rid of as far as racism is concerned. Anti-Semitism has been for thousands of years. So that's something endemic in people. So what do we think that is as psychiatrists? And there's some data about this. You take kids growing up, young kids, at 6, 7 months of age, they start to realize there's difference in skin color and start to react to it. And by the time they're 2.5 years old, they prefer kids who look like them to play with and be with. Now that could be overcome by parents, and that's a small summary of what we have to do with racism, but it's right there. And then the other thing we're born with is that we don't like to feel bad about ourselves. So there's this term called projection, where we try to get rid of what we don't like ourselves and put it on another person and blame them for what we want to get rid of ourselves. Okay, you put those together and groups will then try to be in power, so they protect themselves from their sense of being insecure and in danger, and also make themselves feel better that they're in power, so they're great. So, we got this inborn stuff, and that shows up in different aspects of society. But just like I mentioned about little kids growing up, it can be overcome by our rational mind, what we in medicine call our prefrontal cortex, as long as we find out what's there and look at solutions. And there are potential solutions for this, even though we have to fight against our inborn tendencies here.
In looking at the moment that we're in right now, you commented that this is in line with kind of what you saw in the 1960s, but there is some difference. What's your kind of assessment of this moment?
Yeah, what's different? Well, first of all, we have the pandemic in the background. Which,
yes, there's that.
Which you could say has nothing to do with racism, but of course it does. I mean, first of all, the rate of African Americans dying from COVID is 2 to 3 times the representation in society. So that's one thing. So that, I think, actually leaves everybody on edge somewhat, which is both good and bad. I think being on edge has actually stirred people to help them protest what's going on. And what's different now is this seems to be a coalition of people who are protesting. It's not blacks separately from whites, but a coalition including Hispanics and Asians. So it's much more multicultural. And in the long run, I think that's the way to go. There's been, I think, some disputes both in society and in psychiatry and medicine. Who should be the main spokespeople for these issues? Should it be Black Americans right out front and lead? Or can it be other racial groups like whites or Hispanics? Or is a coalition best? My feeling is it should be all of the above. Black Americans being spokespeople as much as possible, but not all by themselves. And because at the same time, they say they need the help of non-Black people to make this work better in the long run.
In terms of, and I think that a lot of us had an emotional response to George Floyd in particular and seeing, the video. Do you think that from a psychological kind of standpoint, the way that social media is playing, how is this helping the cause or helping causes in this realm? And are there ways in which this is challenging us because of the visuals are there? What are you finding?
I think basically it's good. But why it's so powerful is that I think what happened to him, besides, again, the pandemic in the background, is that it resonates with so much going backwards in time and outside to the rest of society today. So what do I mean by that? First of all, the way he was killed with the knee on his neck and suffocation.
Yeah.
that's a trigger to past traumas, especially hanging, right?
Yeah.
It's not hanging, but it causes death in the same way. So many people, especially Black Americans, may be resonating with that historical stuff, which was so traumatic. We call those triggers to past trauma. And then we've had lots of other deaths by the police in prior years and months. So it resonates out that way. And I think that's what gave it its power. And I think the power is really important to potentially get something done. And that's the long-term key. You know, so far it looks like some changes are being made, but to sustain that and keep it going over time is the real challenge. But I think that energy that and sadness and anger that came from that is more helpful than harmful right now.
So, and in terms of the ways in which, just in terms of how kind of racism continues to be perpetrated or exist in the universe, how much of that do you see is assisted by an echo chamber in kind of a social media universe? You know, that if there is that, you know, that we see the same things, we see things that reinforce our worldview. What role does that play?
Yeah, it's potentially a problem. From what I understand about how systems like Facebook were set up is, for better or worse, they had psychologists involved in setting it up so that people would be reinforced for certain behaviors. One of those behaviors is how we respond to divisiveness and danger. Mm-hmm. And so that gets reinforced in this situation. And in social media, we know how much divisiveness this is. And when people just pay attention to what they already believe and are reinforced by cohorts without getting kind of out of that belief system, it tends just to intensify things, because the danger is here is that we'll be pulled even further apart rather than coming together in unification. So, you know, there's lots of concerns about how the harm the media does and challenges to overcome that, but it's there. You know, lots of information can be shared and coalitions made, but also a lot of divisiveness, which I think everybody has to watch out for.
Are there particular things that, from a psychological standpoint, that you can be like, this is how you kind of weed out when you're in that kind of echo chamber mode, when you're in that place where you're like, just like, since we're in the universe of Facebook Live right now, as opposed to, wait, what am I actually sharing here? Are there ways of pumping the brakes? Because I think it is so easy when you're reading an article, when you see somebody post, you know, an image, just to like, share, expand, rather than having some sort of kind of debate.
Yeah, I think you got to be careful when you think, oh, I like what they're saying because it's just what I believe. I think, you know, we all need to be challenged, and, you know, those likes are one of the reinforcing aspects. And I think it would actually be better when you're told, well, you might like something like this. It isn't what you usually like, but take a look at this, or listen to this, or buy this book because it's different than what you usually read. So be careful when you feel like, God, I'm glad other people feel like I do. I think, equally speaking, when you feel that way, you should look for other sources of information. Then also, if you're getting too angry, I think that's a sign you're too involved with what's going on, and take a break and don't pay attention to social media. You know, how much time you spend during the day on social media is also a potential problem. You know, I think that tendency has probably increased now that everybody's home and we don't have live information,
right,
share or talk to one another.
As you were working on you're in the process of writing an article for, I think, Psychiatry Today?
Yeah, Psychiatry Times, Psychiatric
Times, sorry, about racism in America.
Right.
What are the kind of big things that you are starting to see as you're pulling together your findings from your team? You have a big team that you're working with as well on this article.
Right. It's a multicultural team. Myself, a half-Jewish psychiatrist, so to speak, she calls herself a mutt, 4 African-American psychiatrists, split with gender and age, and then an Indian psychiatrist, who may be the most important person of all, because I think she's kind of a bridge between us. And we've worked 2-3 weeks nonstop to try to come together with something, just a general kind of article like this, a review article that's made, and it wasn't working. We couldn't get enough agreement among us. So then what we decided to do is, let's split this up. Everybody take an issue that they think is of concern, write a short 200-word summary of it with monitoring ideas, and we'll all do that, and we'll have a very brief introduction and conclusion. And now we're almost done. Oh. What that said is that each person needed to have their own voice, and we also needed to come together. And I think that's a model. We also came together on a kind of provocative title, which sort of leads into maybe what everybody can do with this. And the title has something to do with hearing with racial hearing aids, seeing with racial lenses or through racial lenses, getting role models, and raising children in a culturally sensitive way. And all people can do this, and I can provide some examples of what I mean, but it's essentially trying to think of racism almost all the time, on and off. I mean, you don't want to think of that, but it's like a lens of looking at the world and hearing the world that we have to get used to making more often. Otherwise, we don't even notice what's going on.
Is this where, and as Jews, we have this kind of, we are white to all visual, anybody who sees us, they see two white people. And yet we have this kind of secondary identity as Jews where we might also feel like we've experienced, and historically, there is huge amounts of anti-Semitism and things. Is this where this question of privilege really comes in how we identify and using that kind of racial lens to really understand, okay, what is different if visibly you can pass?
Yes, I mean, for racism per se, skin color gives you away, so to speak, right off the bat. People may or may not know that I'm Jewish by how I look, what my name is, but if I had dark skin color, they would often assume I'm black or brown or whatever. So you can't really escape from racism, right? If you're a darker skinned person that looks like they're Black American. And mistakes are made there. Our Indian psychiatrist said she's often mistaken for Black and then treated in the same way. But whether we as Jews think we're white or not, we're identified by outsiders as white. I kind of think we're in the middle, actually, but we're usually identified as white. And so we get a lot of the advantages of that, unless we're identified as Jews, and then the anti-Semitism may come into play. So it's a little complex for us, which also gives us perhaps a little more flexibility of how to respond to it. Also, these are obviously psychological terms, right? The color. We're not really white. They're not really black in color, right. Say. And when we say people of color, everybody has color. There's a famous jazz musician, Marcellus. He's a trumpeter, and he like Wynton Marsalis, and he likes to use the term people have different hues instead of talking about people of color. And I think that's more realistic, but we're right now stuck with these psychologically laden terminology.
As we're looking at things we can do, I mean, I think that we're all in this place where there's so many things that we want to change or that need to change. And when you talk about the psychiatry of racism, how do you even start to unpack that? What are proactive measures we as individuals can take, and then also as organizations as well?
Yes, right. First of all, we have to be interested and concerned about it. And if we're not, to kind of soul search why we're not. But let's talk about those three levels again, because anybody can pay attention to. if we talk about the overall societal racism, then we have to pay attention to when racism may be present in these kind of big aspects of our life. And if we're noticing it, to comment. There was an interesting decision by Quaker Oats that just came out, I think it was today, about taking Aunt Jemima off its Quaker Oats box. Now, any of us could notice that and suggest that happen, right? So we have some responsibility for things like that ourselves. Then we get to the institutional level. So wherever you're working, there are things you can notice too. I got a notice from the Milwaukee Symphony Orchestra yesterday about what they were planning to do about racism. And I'll just give one simple example. Now they want to have music by Black composers on their schedule. They have not. That's simple, but it's a step forward. They listen.
Question of representation.
Yeah. So, and then in ourselves, in our own personal life, we need to do some self-searching. There's a way to find out perhaps how much racism you have inside, because a lot of it's unconscious and out of our consciousness, and we don't want to admit it usually. There's what is called implicit bias tests that you can take. They're easily found, they're free online, and you could do that, as well as talking to people who are from other cultures and honestly ask, do they think you're showing racism in any way? And then, try to deal with that in your individual life. Again, another example of that came up in the newspaper yesterday, the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. The chancellor of the University of Wisconsin-Platteville talked about his life as a Black man and head of the university, but also in his private life. And he said, sadly enough, when he's out of work and he's dressed casually, he's subject to the same racism, the same fear of police, the same thing that happens when he's in an elevator with white people, that they'll want to get off before they're supposed to, or go away from him when he's walking. We shouldn't do that. That's just a sign of racism when we do that. So in our everyday life, there's lots of ways, we could try to address this. And of course, the protests are one thing to try to join them safely. Wearing masks and staying 6 feet away,
right?
An exposure to people of multiple, cultures at the same time, and doing something that may have a positive impact.
From that question of implicit bias and unconscious bias, are there, so taking this test, and then is it kind of confronting those feelings as you're in the elevator saying, nope, I'm staying here. This is not real. This is my bias. Is that kind of the best approach when you're in that?
Yeah, you got it exactly. So if you get some hints from the test of how much bias you have, you can try to make that more conscious in your mind and avoid doing some of the same things. The tricky part is you want to have people that are going to do this with you, like loved ones, to remind you, because again, most of us don't, unless we're hardcore racists, we don't want to hear that we're racist in any sort of degree. So we can have the opposite tendency. We read this or hear this and they say, that's not me. And we just forget about it and are even actually worse than we were before we took the test. So we have to have kind of support to make these kind of changes. It's hard to do all by yourself. It's like trying to analyze yourself like Freud did. It's really hard to do that. You need some outside help and feedback.
As a Jewish community, I think one of the things that I've been especially concerned about is this idea of making a warm and welcoming space for people of color. What are ways that you see that the community has created those spaces, and what are ways that we can do better?
Yeah, that group within us is so important. Sometimes when you say there's a pretty reasonable percentage of Jews of color, which is debated, but it may be 10% or so, people are just amazed.
Maybe even higher.
They're just amazed. It's as if there were none of them. And how could there be 10% of these now? So, first of all, we have to realize it's there. Be welcoming. Watch out again for anything that smacks of racism that you may not realize beforehand. And there's such a great bridge, that they could help be the spokesperson for this whole issue. It's sort of like the Indian psychiatrist I was mentioning, but this kind of bridge person that could really help bridge both sides of the equation. So they're a really key group. I think they've been quite courageous as trying to be part of Judaism, courageous in being part of institutions where they're not welcome, like coming in the building and thinking they're lost or they need to use the bathroom or they're part of hired help. You know, to get exposed to that is just, you know, horrendous from a racial standpoint.
It's certainly beyond the realm of microaggression at that point. That is, you know, that does not say, hey, this is a community and we want you in our community.
Exactly. So the more we can make that welcoming, and I know you're having a session a week from now to talk about that, and it's really important. So, you know, I hope everybody will tune into that.
I hope so too.
Yeah.
Well, Steve, as we're kind of wrapping up, as we're at our end of time here, is there anything else that you feel like is important as people are thinking about this right now that they need to do, that they should do, places to go, resources that you recommend?
Well, you know, there is so much to read and learn about it. And, you know, if people are curious, there is good books, very popular books written by Black Americans. One of them, I don't actually like the term, but I like what's said. It's called, the title has something about white fragility in it. That's worth reading. It's been a very popular book for people to learn about this. You know, that's worth doing. And I think, just like you're doing now, I think all our major Jewish institutions should have some sort of forum to talk about this. We're planning to do that at Congregation Shalom, but it really should be everywhere. You know, it's a little hard now with so much other change going on, the pandemic, staying home, or being on the front line. Even though this is in the news all the time, there are other important things going on, but it's a great time to make progress here. And the big key is to not forget about it after things die down, which they will. The protests are going to die down sometime or other. And that's when things kind of fall by the wayside again. So, you know, I'm pretty confident we can give a lot of attention now, but also, you know, to keep it up, come back and talk about this a year from now. Say.
Right. Where's the momentum and engaging that momentum?
Yeah.
I so appreciate your taking the time to talk with me and with the Jewish Museum Milwaukee audience. Thank you to everybody who watched. I think we have about 15 viewers right now, so very exciting. And as we are continuing these conversations, we are interested in what you guys are thinking, how this relates. Take the implicit bias test. Let us know what are the things that your signposts. I'm interested to do that myself. Next week, we'll be talking with, as Steve mentioned, Dr. Shahana McKenney-Baldwin, who's going to be, she's the Midwest director of ADOT, which is about an organization of Jews of color. I believe she coined the term Jews of color. So I'm really excited to get her sense of both Jewish communal response, broader American response, and seeing how we as a community can be engaged and involved. Thank you. If you've enjoyed this or any of our Conversation Starters Museum moments from the archives, please feel free to visit our website, jewishmuseummilwaukee.org, and you can make a donation there. Thanks very much and have a great day.